One of the biggest things that we get asked about when doing the bicycle maintenance workshops is about how to set up gears and brakes, which seems to be the most common problem that people have when they're doing maintenance at home. So I'm going to run through a few simple techniques just to help you get the most out of your equipment. We're going to get started with the brakes. So the first thing I'm going to show you is how to change the brake shoes. So release the brake and take the front wheel out. Now, if this groove has disappeared, that would indicate that the shoes need replacing. So to do that, it's really simple. On the side, there's a little grub screw which retains the pad. First of all, you need to take that out, which is very simple. Use an Allen key. Take the grub screw out, and then simply press the brake lever, push the pad out backwards, yeah, and there we go. And there we have, that's the pad that we need. Now if you're unsure which pad you need when you go to the shop, just take the old ones along with you and it'll make sure you get the correct one for your bike. Now to refit it, it's very simple. Just simply press the lever again, press it in from the back, new brake shoe installed, but the most important thing is to refit the grub screw, because that's what's going to stop the pad falling out. The next thing we need to check is to make sure that the pad is actually in line with the rim. This one looks like it's a little bit too low, but we certainly want to make sure that it contacts the brake surface properly. We certainly don't want it touching the tyre, and we don't want it rubbing in the spokes. So just turn the brakes back on. Now we've replaced the pad. Yeah, can you see there? This one looks far too low. So what we need to do is basically lift the pad up. So loosen it off with an Allen key. Now it's important to remember when you're doing this, you can only do one side at a time. So what you need to do is position the pad against the rim, squeeze the brake to hold the pad in position, and then simply retighten. And the brake is in a perfect position every time. And then just repeat the process on the other side. So now that we've put the new pad in and repositioned it, the next thing we need to check is to make sure that there's plenty of cable pull on the lever. Now this looks like there's too much cable, so we need to tighten it up. So very simply, for this we need a 5mm Allen key, and we're going to use the cable clamp here on the side. And again, not going to use any particular special tools or anything, just a real simple technique for doing it correctly. So first thing to do is totally open the cable, yeah, and let the cable sit slack in the caliper. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to reset the adjuster back down to the bottom again, because in future, now I've got new pads, I might need to use that to take up any cable slack in future, so I'll just reset that back to the bottom again. Okay, so very simply, all we need to do to set the cable position is hold the cable, but don't pull it, and then squeeze the caliper together so it just touches the rim, and then simply let go of the cable and just retighten it. So to tighten it, just get it so it touches, and then give it half a turn, yeah, and that's nice and tight, and then you need to double check it using the lever. So give it 3 really good strong pumps on the lever to make sure that the cable's not going to slip through. Yeah. Okay, now that's actually a little tight, which is fine. So to adjust it, to make it a little bit slacker, all you do is simply open the screw, let a little bit of cable through, and then tighten it again. And then always go back and recheck. And that's perfect. Don't want your brakes too tight, because on a long ride your hands will get very sore, but you also want to make sure that it's not slack, so that basically you can actually stop the bike if you need to. So it really is that simple. Just showing you a few quick setup tips there, and you can save yourself an absolute fortune. If you took that down to your local cycle store, that probably would have cost you about £20 to have that adjustment done, but helping you to save both time and money. Now the next thing we're going to look at is to do with indexing the gears, and this is probably the biggest thing that people struggle with as cyclists. It's very, very simple to set up. So let's take a look at the gears. I think the first thing we need to explain is that when you're setting up the gears, it's make life easy for yourself by putting it in a neutral gear. and what that means is one that isn't actually bending or flexing the chain. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put it in the big ring at the front, and I'm also going to put it in the 5th sprocket up at the back. So I'm just going to change gear very quickly. One, two, three, four, five. That's perfect. Okay, and what that does, that actually means that the chain is straight, and it's also got a little bit of tension in the rear derailleur, so there's a little bit of spring in the chain. Okay, that's a good position to start from. So very carefully, I'm just going to turn the crank, yeah, and by basically tightening and loosening the rear adjuster here, yeah, I can actually move the position of the derailleur up or down so it runs smoothly. So if I slacken the cable, yeah, you can see it's running out of position, so I need to retighten it. Again, that's so it's running in the centre, and that's pretty smooth. The easiest way to do it is to actually listen to the chain, and so it's not rattling. So we're in position there. Now once you've got it in position, the next thing you need to do is to move the shifter, just to make sure that it's moving one click and it moves one sprocket. Yeah, that's obviously pretty good. On the rear of the derailleur, you'll notice that there's 3 screws. These 2 screws here, they're called limiter screws, and they limit the amount of movement from the top to the bottom. This screw controls the tension of the rear mech. It's called the B tension screw, and that controls the position of the top jockey wheel in relation to the cassette. Ideally, you want about 1.5 chain links between the 2. So this isn't tight enough at the moment, so we just need to tighten that up. Give that a good few turns. And then next thing, we obviously need to go back and double check it. That's a lot better. Because I've increased the screw tension, the chain is now not rubbing here. Okay, so now what I've done is I've positioned the rear mech, and we're actually in 1st gear, we're up at the top of the cassette. What I'm going to do now is using this screw, which is for a low gear, which makes it easy for climbing up hills. I'm going to just check that that is in the correct position. So it won't move now because it's actually sat against the limiter screw. So that's perfect. It means that if I push it, the rear mech isn't going to go into the spokes. So we now need to check it won't go into the frame. So we need to drop it all the way down. Yeah. And then check the high screw. That's a high gear, which is obviously easy for going downhill or pedaling on the flat. Yeah, and that one's a little bit loose. So just 1/4 of a turn, just give it a little pull. That's perfect. And that'll stop the chain jumping into the frame, which is obviously not what you don't want. Great. So now we know that they're in correct position, we can just go back and run through the gears again. So now we're happy that everything's okay with the rear derailleur, we need to just concentrate and make sure everything's okay at the front. So very simply, all I'm going to do is put the bike into 1st gear. That's the easiest pedalling gear. So that's the large sprocket at the back and the inner ring at the front. Okay, what we're looking for are a few simple things which can make it work properly. First thing is make sure that the actual height of the derailleur is only about 2 or 3 millimeters gap between the top of the tooth and the bottom of the outside plate. If it's too high, the chain won't shift properly, and if it's too low, obviously it'll just rub on the ring. So the optimal gap there is about 2mm. The other thing you need to do is to make sure that the actual angle of the mech is correct. So the other thing to check is to make sure that this part of the derailleur, as well as being the correct height, is parallel with the ring, otherwise it won't shift properly. The other thing we need to check are these limiter screws here. Now, ideally the derailleur needs to be about 1mm away from the chain so that it can't drop down onto the frame or overshift onto where the pedal would be. So we're just going to use this, and as you see, as I turn the screw, the derailleur moves in and out, and we're looking for about 1mm gap behind. And once we're happy with that, we need to put the chain in the highest gear. So put it all the way to the bottom sprocket at the back and lift it up onto the outer ring. Yeah. Now this is a little close, so what we need to do here is just ever so slightly open that with about 1/8 of a turn. Yeah. And that gives us just enough gap so that it won't catch on the derailleur when you're pedalling. Again, once you've done everything, make sure you go back and double check that it works properly before you go out for a ride. That's great. Perfect. We're ready to hit the road.